Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's Q&A virtual lunch hour. My name is Jason Killeen, and I'm an Assistant Executive Director with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. So before we get started, I just wanted to have a few welcome remarks. I know a lot of the questions may be related to the state's upcoming deadlines. So for folks that are existing social equity applicants, we are doing everything in our power to move those records forward. My team is going to be working overtime over the next several weeks to basically clear the deck of pre-application review records as well as temporary approval application records. The director has asked me to put together a list of pending records, and she would like to know what the statuses are. And our analysts are going to be reaching out to the businesses to let them know what they need to do to make sure that they get a status of local compliance underway if they already have an application submitted. So for the state's deadline, the city decoupled from the state's process more than a year ago. And by decoupling with the state, the city no longer required somebody to provide a copy of the provisional license in order to be eligible for temporary approval. So a business doesn't have to have temporary approval in order to qualify for a state provisional license. When you submit your provisional application, one of the things the state asks for is a document showing that you have local compliance underway. And the state does reach out to the city to verify that local compliance. So if you've submitted an application with the city, some folks have used that as evidence previously, and then they navigate and they work with DCR to make sure that their temporary approval application is deemed filed. When the temporary approval application is deemed filed, the applicant has submitted all of the necessary documents to the city and paid the corresponding application fee. And then, of course, we issue a notice of local compliance underway. That is the document that the state is looking for from social equity applicants prior to issuing a provisional license. So for folks that want to get into the state queue, you have the ability to submit your provisional application to the state. You're just going to want to make sure that you have a corresponding temporary approval application filed before DCR so that you can get your notice of local compliance underway before the state completes processing your provisional application. And I know that we're going to have a number of questions about the different documents, the different record types as we go through the Q&A. So I won't bombard everybody with that. We can go ahead and hop into the Q&A if we're ready to get started.
We are always ready, Jason. Good afternoon. The first question comes from Jesse S. Is there an anticipated timeline on when the PCN process will be open?
Great question. So we're hoping to have the process reopened later this year. As folks may know, we have a pending report, Council File 2110-1083-S1, that's pending before the Planning and Land Use Management Committee. That report articulates what the proposed annual application process is going to look like, and DCR is recommending a shift that would move the final inspection and the permitting requirements from other local, county, and state agencies until after we've made a licensing determination, which will streamline our process and allow us to issue the environmental analysis reports that the state needs for their annual application process. Because the PCN process can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months, we know that the state's provisional licensure program will have already expired at that point. And we want folks that do decide to go through the PCN process to know whether or not council has adopted our recommended strategy, which will cut the existing process in half, or if folks are going to have to wait 12 to 18 months before they can qualify for their state annual application. So once we get further movement on that, we will make some announcements as it relates to the PCN process and what the requirements to participate in the PCN process are.
Okay, our next question from David W. has to do again with the March 31st deadline. His question is specific. I have submitted my pre-approval application and I'm waiting now for DCR's approval. My question is, from this point, can I still meet the state's provisional license deadline of March 31st?
The answer for David is, have you submitted your application to the state? So the most important thing is to make sure that you submit your application to the state before the March 31st deadline. We will have cleared the deck of all of the pre-approval applications that are pending through the end of this week by the end of next week. And then that will enable folks that are eligible for further processing to submit their temporary approval application if they would like to move forward. We're talking with the Office of Finance and the City Attorney's Office about some of the options to determine whether or not we can recognize a pending payment in advance of it appearing on our LA tax report. And if we are able to work something out with finance and the city attorney's office, that would expedite our review of new pre-application review records and temporary approval applications that come in advance of the state's upcoming deadlines. But folks don't need anything directly from us prior to submitting their provisional license application to the state if they're a social equity applicant. You know, you can upload a copy of your pre-app invoice or your status that you're eligible for further processing or your invoice for your temporary approval application record as that local evidence. And then when the state reaches out to us, to the extent that you have your temporary approval application deemed filed, so you've submitted all of the necessary documentation, you've paid the fee, then we would communicate local compliance is underway, which is a prerequisite to getting your state provisional license. But you don't have to have temporary approval. You don't have to have a notice of local compliance underway letter to start the state provisional application. So there is still time for folks to get their applications together and submit it to the state well in advance of the March 31st deadline.
Okay, moving on. Chanel W asks, can I begin the application process if I don't have a location secured?
So applicants can register for a business tax registration certificate, create a legal business entity record, go through the equity share review process without having a location secured. You can complete the pre-application review process without having site control, but we do need you to identify a proposed business premises location so that we can make sure that it's properly zoned as well as distanced from sensitive uses. When you are ready to submit your commercial cannabis license application, you will have to have site control, and it is ultimately tied to the location. So there's some things you can do without having any location, such as registering the BTRC, creating the legal business entity record, going through equity share review. There are things where you don't have to have a location secured, but you do have to propose a business premises address, which is our pre-application review process. And then if the location is deemed eligible for further processing, then you have up to a year to submit your application, which then gives you the opportunity to finish up negotiations with the landlord and or purchase the property that you would like to continue to pursue.
Thank you. Laheven J asks, is there an opportunity to enter into a separate entity partnership for a cannabis delivery, cultivation, or testing lab that's not part of the social equity program? If you are phase 3, round 1, tier 1 qualified and currently have a partnership entity that's part of the social equity program. And let me know if you want me to repeat that.
I'm going to take a stab at answering it. So individuals or natural people are verified as social equity individual applicants. That individual has the ability to, be a part of a partnership or an LLC or a corporation, and they can apply and be part of multiple entities, as long as they comply with the limitations on the number of licenses that they can be a part of. So generally, an individual can be an owner of up to 3 retail storefront locations that allow for on-site sales and up to 3 medium cultivation licenses. So, for the delivery, you as a verified individual applicant can be the social equity owner of an LLC pursuing delivery, as well as the social equity owner of a corporation pursuing a delivery license. So you can pursue license types outside of whatever partnership or entity you may be currently associated with, but you do have to submit a new application.
Okay, Michelle G asks, when a license that has been abandoned and then refiled, can the retail location be in any community plan area as long as it is not uh, over concentrated? Excuse me.
So a license itself is not deemed abandoned. If an application is deemed abandoned, then it can be refiled. And under the updated law, folks can refile in any community plan area that has not reached undue concentration. If you had a license in calendar year 2022, you submitted your renewal application and you failed to pay your fees, when that renewal application is deemed abandoned, that will give you the opportunity to refile it, and that will allow for you to refile in any community plan area that has not reached undue concentration. But you do have to understand that once your license has expired, it is expired, and the current code does not create a relief mechanism for you to reapply or revive that license outside of the annual renewal process. DCR did make a recommendation to allow for folks that have expired licenses to come back into the regulatory framework within 3 years of the license expiring. But that recommendation, again, is still pending with the Planning and Land Use Management Committee.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Lavon E is asking if there are any updates regarding round 3 lottery for those who are social equity verified in 2022.
No updates at this time. Again, everything is tied to this report that's pending in the Planning and Land Use Management Committee. Before we take on new applicants, either through an additional lottery or the PCN process, we need to be able to communicate what this annual application process is going to look like and what holding costs may be associated with pursuing those opportunities. So hopefully within the next couple of weeks, committee will schedule our report and we can start moving it forward so that we can start announcing dates for future lotteries as well as the PCN process.
Our next question comes from Rafi S. I need to move from my current CPA because I'm having problems with my landlord. What can I do?
So if you're an applicant and you lose site control or you can't move forward, you would submit the business premises surrender form and the record would be deemed abandoned because all of the analysis is tied to that location. And then through the refiling process, you could pursue a location outside of the community plan area. If you have a license, licenses for retail storefront and cultivation have the ability to be relocated within a community plan area. So you could, submit a relocation request for the CPA that you're currently in. if you can't find a compliant location within that CPA, the only ability for us to create a relief for you would be for us to abandon a renewal application during the renewal periods, and then that would give you the opportunity to refile. So those are really your options. Again, DCR has recommended giving licensees the opportunity to relocate their licenses outside of their current CPA. But again, it's still pending with the Planning and Land Use Management Committee.
Okay, our question from Charles D is as follows. Are there fee waivers for social equity applicants?
Currently, we're providing fee waivers for Phase 3 Retail Round 2 applicants that submit their pre-application review, their equity share documents, and their temporary approval documents. We may be able to expand the fee waivers when more funding is available. And then, we plan on starting to transition general applicants and social equity applicants into the annual application process this year. And we do have funding from the $22 million grant to provide fee waivers under that program. So if we do have the adopted standalone annual application process, we could utilize that process to provide fee waivers to new social equity applicants submitting annual applications for the first time. So stay tuned.
Will do. Our next question also comes from Charles D. And he asks, does DCR conduct background checks?
No, we do not. The state does background checks as part of their application process, and we didn't want to be duplicative of their activities, so we leave it up to the state.
Okay, the next question from Doug W. Will the delivery license application period end?
Currently, there's no sunset date on DCR's ability to accept new delivery applications, and the delivery activity is not capped, so it's not subject to a finding of undue concentration.
Our next question also from Doug W. When can social equity applicants sell their business to non-social equity buyers?
At this time, there's not a provision in the municipal code that would allow for a social equity license to be sold to a non-social equity business.
Destiny L is asking about social equity applications or verifications windows reopening. Do you know when that will be?
The social equity individual applicant verification window will reopen later this year. There's some pending criteria changes that we're going to be recommending to streamline the process and make it more user-friendly.
Destiny has a follow-up question. Will social equity requirements still be based on zip codes?
So the eligibility criteria were based on zip codes back in 2019, but council amended the law, I believe in either 2020 or 2021, and it was based on police reporting districts. So we will be making some recommendations to streamline the process.
Okay, thank you. The next question from Rob M. Why is the tax so high and when will they go down?
So, DCR is aware that there's a number of taxes placed on commercial cannabis businesses. At the local level, the business tax was set by the voters at, between 1% and 10%, depending on the commercial cannabis activity. And then the excise taxes are set at the state level. I know there's conversations that have been happening about what to do about the taxes, but it's something that DCR doesn't have a direct control over. And really the state only has the ability to weigh in on the business taxes that are assessed by the Office of Finance. So unfortunately, I don't know if the taxes will go down. And for our business taxes, they're commensurate with the tax rates that were in place and adopted by, well, similar to what was in place prior to the adoption of the regulated market, and what was adopted by the voters back in 2017.
Okay, our next question from Rodrigo L is long. So if you need me to repeat any part of it, please let me know, Jason. When we applied for our phase 2 license in 2018, our property was zoned M1. However, since then, the property has been rezoned to CM. We've since invested a lot of money into this project. Will this create an issue when we apply for annual licensure, even though when we applied the property was correctly zoned?
If a license has been issued at the property, then you would effectively be able to continue on and pursue an annual license at the property, even if it's been rezoned. If you applied and you never received a license and you didn't get a license before the code was amended to allow for us to make the land use determinations earlier in the process, because previously they were done at the time a license was issued, then you may not be eligible to pursue an annual license because we wouldn't have the authority currently to issue a license. So it really depends on where you are and whether or not you have a license. And I would recommend reaching out to your assigned analyst.
Okay, our next question comes from Sharisa C. Are approved social equity applicants the only ones able to get a manufacturing or distribution license at this time?
No, there's no restriction on the non-volatile manufacturing, the type 6 licenses. So either type 6, the type S, which is the shared facilities, the type P for packaging, the type N for infusion. Anybody can apply for those. And then for the distribution, general applicants have the ability to apply for distribution and the distribution transport only.
Okay, our next question from Neruth B. What are the consequences or penalties for not following good faith hiring requirements?
So DCR could issue a notice of violation and or assess a fine for, a violation of our rules and regs or the municipal code.
Okay, Ronnie M is asking, where can I find capital to fund a retail space?
So I know the department and some of our social equity partners are going to be working on an event called Cannabis and Capital. And I believe that event is going to be on February 24th. And it's going to be held at the convention center. There's going to be different speakers providing advice on that subject matter. And I would expect that it's going to be attended not only by applicants and licensees, but also by, cannabis investors and, operators that are outside of the city. It's going to be from 1 to 7, and I do believe it's on February 24th. It's free, and there is an RSVP link that I know is on our website, and one of our folks can probably drop it into the chat for today's Q&A session.
Thank you, Jason. Levon E asks, if an applicant from phase 3 round 1 was denied because of sensitive use, but an updated version of land use doesn't show sensitive use, is council going to approve re-review?
we've made that recommendation for several years. And again, the report that's pending with the Planning and Land Use Management Committee does have the recommendation to allow for DCR to re-review round one records that were deemed ineligible due to a sensitive use, so that the applicant would have the opportunity to pursue a compliant location within that CPA, or under the new rules, file in a different CPA. But we can't move forward with that until our recommendation gets adopted and it becomes law.
Okay, question from Anthony T. Does the area zoned as open space around a freeway count as sensitive use?
It depends. So the open space designation is really tied to the park's sensitive use. When we do the analysis, we're looking to see whether or not that location, that parcel, falls within one of our sensitive use list. And I know that there are parks that are adjacent to the freeway and the open space that are sensitive uses. And then I know that there's landscape medians and other things that don't rise to a level of being considered a sensitive use. To find out whether or not something is considered a sensitive use, you could pay the pre-application review fee for the proposed business premises address, so that we would do the analysis and look at what is around.
Okay, we have a second question from Anthony. What is required in place of a lease if you're purchasing instead of renting?
So assuming that you're going to be going through the application process, you could show us the purchase agreement, you could show us the deed if you've already purchased the parcel, or if you're going into escrow, you could provide us the escrow documents. Ultimately, you will have to have site control of the location and pass an inspection before you're eligible for temporary approval or an annual license. But there are documents instead of a lease that could be utilized.
Thank you. Moving on. Stephen D. wants to know when cultivation licenses will be available again.
The earlier of DCR administering a lottery that makes cultivation licenses available to prospective social equity applicants, or January 1st, 2025, when there's no longer a restriction on the applicants that can apply for that license, whichever comes sooner.
Okay. Stephen is also asking, how do we protect our companies from business entity fraud?
Make sure that somebody is checking with the different agencies that utilize your business entity information, the Secretary of State, making sure that the Office of Finance and others know who the authorized people are, and you get all of your filings in. And then you've set up for notifications if somebody attempts to change that information. Really, the onus is going to be on the company to make sure, just like the onus is on an individual to prevent somebody from creating identity theft, to make sure that you're registered with credit agencies, you're registered with different entities. So if there's a change in the status, you're immediately notified. And if it is fraudulent, you can step in immediately to try to get it corrected.
We have two individuals asking similar questions, from Kimberly B. and Albert H. How do I get started in the cannabis industry?
Going to DCR's website and looking at what it takes to become an applicant is a helpful tool. There's also, opportunities to be an employee in the cannabis industry. The social equity team and our licensed businesses partner to do various workforce development type trainings and seminars and give people the opportunity to, submit their application for some of our licensed entities. I believe the team is planning a webinar over the next couple of months that will provide a step-by-step process on getting a commercial cannabis license. So it really depends on what you are trying to get involved in. And if you're trying to be a business owner or you're trying to be an employee, you might want to be an investor. But our website does have a bunch of information. And if you sign up for our emails as different webinars and collateral materials are released, at least you'll get a heads up.
Good advice. Thanks, Jason. Our next question comes from Kimberly B. What other types of things can you do under the licensing umbrella?
So I'm going to take a stab at interpreting licensing umbrella. DCR can accept applications for testing, distribution, retail storefronts, non-volatile manufacturing, and then delivery. We're not currently accepting cultivation or volatile manufacturing applications at this time, and certain activities are limited to verified social equity individual applicants. A list of kind of the high level activities that are allowed under each license type is available on our website, as well as on the Department of Cannabis Control's website, which is the corresponding state agency. So if you're looking for kind of a list of what's available, as well as what activities can be conducted under the list, I would refer you to our website and the Department of Cannabis Control's website.
Our next question from Angela P. We have a C10 retail license currently and want to start doing delivery. Do we need to go to any type of inspection in order to start the delivery? Can you help me with the process, please?
So at the local level, if you have a retail storefront license or a micro business license that allows on-site retail sales, the delivery activity falls under our local license type. So you wouldn't have to go through an additional inspection to engage in delivery because it would already be authorized by your existing retail storefront license. But if you are doing tenant improvements, you're going to have a place where you're going to store product on site tied to the delivery activities, and you're updating your premises diagram, you may have to submit, a business premises diagram modification or something else just to reflect you taking on this new activity or changing your business premises to help facilitate your engagement in that activity. If you're a licensee, reach out to your assigned analyst and you can talk to them about what your specific situation is and how taking on this additional activity may impact what's been previously approved by the department.
Our next question from Shady M asks, when will I be able to apply for SEIA verification as I am low income for the last 2 years?
So we hope to open up the verification process again later this year. As I previously mentioned, we're hopeful that we can streamline the criteria so that folks understand how they can meet the criteria. And we will have recommendations pending that will hopefully get adopted in the upcoming months that will help facilitate us reopening that process.
Okay, Sam M asks, does an arrest in Orange County count for SEIA verification?
A California cannabis arrest that occurred prior to November 8th, 2016 would satisfy one of the eligibility criteria, provided that you can one, show documentation, and two, that documentation clearly makes it associated with a marijuana or cannabis related offense.
Ruben R is asking if I have a social equity license approved address, can you move the license to a different location?
So under the semantics of it is licenses are not transferable. If you have a license, you could submit a relocation request, and if it's eligible for further processing, we would create a new application at your proposed location, and then you'd have the ability to pursue licensure at that new location. But again, licenses are not transferable. So it's not like you can take your license from 123 Main Street and then move it to 221 Fig. You will have to submit an application for the new location and meet all of the application and licensing requirements before a license is issued for that other location.
Our next question from Daryl C asks, can you tell the types of licenses that are available now if you were verified in 2019?
I mean, the types of licenses that you were able to apply for has not changed. So the non-storefront delivery as well as the PCN process, the cultivation licenses, when they reopen, you would be able to apply for it. The code doesn't sunset the 2019 criteria. However, the code does limit who can participate in future lotteries, and it requires a qualifying conviction under the current law.
Okay, our next question comes from it's number 20, Neruth B. Licenses are expected to fill out a survey annually, once for every licensed location for good faith hiring requirement reporting. Is there a specific deadline on when the business should submit a survey? Are they also still required to schedule a 15-minute virtual assessment annually for each location?
Can you run that one by me one more time?
Sure. This has to do with good faith hiring requirements and reporting. Is there a specific deadline on when businesses should submit the survey? And are they still required to schedule a 15-minute virtual assessment annually for each location?
So I think it's tying in two unrelated things. For the good faith hiring requirements, the code requires a semi-annual report that would come in January and in July. And DCR is seeking to have this information come in as part of our renewal process. The new unit that Rocky is overseeing for the compliance and enforcement division is going to be developing and working with businesses on how they can meet the various requirements. As it relates to like virtual inspections and virtual assessments, those may be tied to compliance with the rules and regs as well as the Muni Code, and good faith hiring falls under that. Or it could be associated with other compliance related issues that this new unit is going to be taking up. So I would stay tuned because the compliance and enforcement division is currently staffing up and they're working on materials and preparing to do future webinars to make sure that applicants and licensees are well aware of what requirements exist for their businesses.
Thanks, Jason. Moving on to a question from Daryl C. Is there a license that covers all types available at one cost, or do you have to pay for them each separately as far as delivery, distribution, non-volatile, cultivation, and testing lab?
Every activity requires a separate application fee.
Okay. Jimmy R. asks, can phase 2 licenses move to neighboring community plan areas?
The cultivation licenses, which were available in phase 2, can only be relocated within the existing community plan area, but non-volatile manufacturing and distribution, which were also available in phase 2, aren't subject to the finding of undue concentration, and they could be relocated to any community plan area because it doesn't create an issue with other applicants or licensees.
A question from Ayana J. If I do not have a location for my facility, can I still apply for the seed program?
For the current seed program, applicants have to have a lease or a binding letter of intent. So if you don't have a location, you wouldn't be eligible to apply for seed grants funds.
Thanks, Jason. George, sorry, this is another question from Iana. Is the social equity program countywide?
No, the city's social equity program only covers licenses that can be issued by the Department of Cannabis Regulation, which is a Los Angeles City department. We don't have any oversight of any other commercial cannabis programs within the county or the county's program.
Okay, the next question from George T. It is long, so bear with me and I will repeat those parts that you need, Jason, just let me know. During the modification request webinar, you were discussing undue concentration limits and used Hollywood Community Plan area as an example. When you click the Hollywood Community Plan area on the map, it says that there is a retail license capacity set at 20 and that there are 9 non-PCN slots available. When you go through and add the retail temporary approval layer, the map shows 20 green dots indicating Hollywood CPA has reached undue concentration limit. Has Hollywood reached undue concentration? Is the map accurate?
So Hollywood has not reached undue concentration yet, and the map is accurate as of last month. One of the complicating things for undue concentration is undue concentration is triggered by the issuance of licenses. So the DCR accepting an application does not trigger an additional count towards undue concentration. The phase 3 retail round 1 applicants and the phase 1 applicants were not subject to a finding of undue concentration. So all of phase 1 and the first 100 from phase 3 retail round 1. And the folks that have not received a license yet, of course, don't count towards undue concentration for that community plan. So the example with Hollywood is there's a license capacity set at 20, and I believe we've issued about 11 licenses. So there's 9 more licenses that can be issued without an applicant having to get a public convenience or necessity finding from the Los Angeles City Council. Once we've exhausted all 9 of those non-PCN licenses, every other application pending within the Hollywood Community Plan area would require a public convenience or necessity finding in order for us to issue a license. And that's all kind of articulated in the code. So we still have capacity to issue licenses. Hollywood is not unduly concentrated. However, there are enough applications pending in that community plan area that if every applicant is eligible for licensure, we could hit undue concentration, and the 21st business would have to get that PCN finding from the council. Otherwise, they would not be eligible for licensure. DCR also is making recommendations to modify undue concentration so that it's triggered earlier based on the acceptance of an application, because that lengthy explanation that I just gave is not common sense, nor is it easy for a non-DCR employee to understand.
Thank you, Jason. Our next, excuse me, question comes from Yongq Y. When is the next retail license application lottery?
Hopefully we're going to have it later this year. Again, we have a report pending before the Planning and Land Use Management Committee that would implement a standalone annual application process, which will reduce the period of time and the holding costs associated with somebody pursuing a retail license opportunity within the city of LA. So we're trying to get that through and adopted so that folks don't have to go through the existing process and they can jump immediately into the annual process. And to the extent we can, if we can shift the final inspection and the compliance with the certificate of occupancy, health permits, fire permits, building permits until after we've made a licensing determination, one, that will expedite the application processing and result in issuing the environmental review doc that you need for the state's annual application process. But it will also give you peace of mind that you would be eligible for licensure before you spend, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars with other agencies to do build outs and to comply with different requirements, only to find out later that you're not eligible for licensure. So we're trying to reduce holding costs, bring peace of mind to the front of the process before you go through the expensive endeavor of pursuing a commercial cannabis license. So hopefully Plum Committee will schedule our report and it will be adopted, and then we can work with the city's attorney's office on the draft ordinances to make it law.
Jose D asks, is the verification process for the upcoming PCN process going to be mandatory to have a conviction?
So under current law, the PCN process is not limited to folks that have a conviction. So folks that were verified either under the 2019 or the 2022 criteria would be eligible to participate in the PCN process. And then beginning in 2025, when there's no longer a restriction on who can submit that type of application, it would open up to general applicants as well.
And Jose has a follow-up question. What is the PCN process opening date so we can start looking for properties?
So, again, I would track council file number 21-1083-S1 to wait to see when it's going to be scheduled and if it gets adopted, because that report moving through the legislative process is really going to drive how quickly the department can open up the PCN process as well as administer future lotteries to make the remaining capacity available.
Our next question from Luis R. Refers back to that council file you just mentioned, and he asks, when and what license types can be refiled based on the charges outlined in council file number 21-1083 S1 item 1.
Was that all of the information that we got with the question?
That is correct.
Okay. Bear
He
with me.
does, he does have a follow-up question that perhaps might provide some more context, if you'd like me to ask that as well.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Okay, so he asks, what changes can be made to an existing PCN application in progress? For example, can it submit a modification request to relocate to another location within the same community plan?
So a PCN finding is site specific. So that finding is only good for the location that council approved it at. And an application cannot be modified away from whatever location the PCN finding was made. If the PCN application results in licensure, once a license has been issued, then the relocation rules are the same as any other licensee. But as it relates to an applicant, you cannot modify the location listed on the PCN request.
Thank you, Jason.
You're welcome. And
Go ahead.
for number I, it the letter I in the October, November version of the DCR report is going to be slightly different than the I in the December version of the report, which is going to be slightly different than the I in the report that we released last month. So based on the most current version of the report, that's how I'm going to base my answer. And that's the new section that creates the annual license. So, it's right now, the refiling process is tied to the temporary approval application process. And at some point, there's no benefit to applying for temporary approval because you're going to need a document from the city to have a complete annual application with the state. So temporary approval loses its benefit. If you have temporary approval, continuing to renew that temporary approval along with renewing your state license allows you to continue operating. But for new folks coming into the regulatory process, or for folks that did not take advantage of temporary approval or provisional licensure, an annual license is really the only path forward. So if we create our standalone annual licensing process, and something needs to be refiled, it would allow for it to be refiled as an annual application so that the applicant can submit everything at the front end of the application process, submit their final project description so we can work on everything, as opposed to having somebody submit for temporary approval and then having to be eligible for temporary approval before they could go through the environmental review, before they could go through the annual review, because that just adds time. So that section I in the creating the standalone annual really collapses everything into a single step for the applicant and gives DCR the ability to start reviewing everything in parallel to reduce the processing timelines. And then additionally, we're trying to shift the final inspection and the verification of the permitting requirements for other agencies until after we make the licensing determination, so that it reduces holding costs, and then you get peace of mind that you would be eligible for licensure before you sink the cost of all of the building permits and fire permits and health permits and everything else that may be necessary for the process. So we'll see where the recommendation goes, and hopefully that was the section the question was related to.
Okay. Albert H is asking about capital, and specifically, is there a bank that you recommend?
DCR unfortunately can't provide business advice. At the Cannabis and Capital event that's going to be later this month, there would be opportunities to network and get information about how you can set up a bank or access capital. So I would recommend you attending that event, or at least trying to get information from our website as it relates to the event so that you can make those contacts.
Daryl S is asking, is there a way to look over the years that I verify that I lived in a correct area for 10 years?
On the licensing map available on DCR's website under the licensing tab, there's a layer for the social equity requirements, which identify the disproportionately impacted areas that were part of the study. So you can use the search function to just type in your address and search and see whether or not it falls within the pink disproportionately impacted area zones.
Daryl S has another question, but I'm not sure the context of his question. I'm not sure if it's regarding SEIA verification or license application. Perhaps you can address some of those. And he asks, when is the resubmission of the application starting?
So if somebody is eligible to refile, they can refile now. For the lottery process, we're waiting for council to adopt the standalone annual application process before we conduct the next lottery so that folks know how long they're going to be in the process before they could start to operate. And then we plan on reopening the social equity verification process later this year. It would be ideal to just have one verification program, grandfather folks in from 2019 that met at least two of the criteria, and then just it doesn't really matter what year you got verified. You're either a social equity individual applicant and you've been verified or you're not, and that'll streamline the process and make it easier. And then we won't have different groups of folks and then have to figure out what year you got verified in and what criteria you met in order to participate in programming or application opportunities. So be on the lookout. We've got a draft report that's been vetted that would streamline that criteria and hopefully make it easier and our social equity program more accessible to the folks that have been impacted by the war on drugs.
Our next question comes from Jean G. When is the City of Los Angeles going to start enforcing against illegal dispensaries?
So the city already enforces against unlicensed dispensaries. Any complaints about those unlicensed dispensaries are forwarded to the LAPD, and then they work with their other enforcement partners, the city attorney's office, Department of Water and Power, Building and Safety, on how to mitigate the unlicensed activity. DCR doesn't have any authority over unlicensed businesses or have any enforcement tools to utilize against those businesses. But if you are aware of unlicensed commercial cannabis activity, you can submit a complaint through the portal, and there is a link on DCR's website.
Jason, I wanted to check on your time. We're at the 1 o'clock hour.
What does it mean when it says?
Unfortunately, I do have another meeting today.
Okay.
But I can take like one or two more questions.
It's almost over now, so we have.
Okay, thank you, Jason. The next question is from Evelyn S. When will current license holder get a renewal update?
So folks that were licensed in 2022 were eligible to go through the 2023 renewal process. And that process started last September and it goes through February 28th.
Okay, and then our last question is a follow-up or an additional question from Evelyn. When will a second grant be issued to applicants?
So at this time, DCR doesn't have any additional grant monies for the direct financial assistance, like the seed program was, the first version of the seed program. There was a limited amount of funding that could be used for folks that had a location secured, but there's no other than, the possibility for fee waivers tied to the environmental review and the annual application process. And then for phase 3 retail round 2 applicants, we don't have other grant monies available to provide a financial assistance or waivers to applicants. But stay tuned, because the social equity team is always applying for new grant funding opportunities.
Thank you, Jason, for your time today.
You're welcome. And if possible, any questions I wasn't able to get to, if we could just carry over to the next Q&A session, it would be much appreciated.
We can do that, certainly.
Thank you. I just want to thank everybody for coming, and hopefully we'll announce the next Q&A session very shortly or very soon.